The sinister truth behind Mike Fink, the river king who killed for fun on the muddy waters of America's early frontier. One name echoed louder than the crash of riverboats: Mike Fink. To generations who heard his tales, he was the unstoppable king of the Boatmen, a larger-than-life figure whose strength, jokes, and wild personality turned him into a legend. Children grew up hearing how he could outdrink, outfight, and outshoot any rival. But beneath the roar of laughter and the bravado of campfire stories, a far darker truth was hiding. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below. Your support keeps these hidden stories alive and helps us bring more unsettling truths to light. Because the truth about Mike Fink is not the one passed down in tall tales. He wasn't simply a folk hero of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. He was a man who killed for sport, whose violent temper left bodies behind. His myth was polished, retold, and celebrated, while the bloodier parts of his life sank beneath the surface, forgotten or deliberately ignored. And as we peel back the layers of his story, you'll see how America's so-called heroes were often built on shadows. Mike Fink's name has always carried a strange mix of admiration and fear, but the version most people know leans heavily on admiration. In countless retellings, he appears as the boisterous king of the Boatmen, the rowdy yet charming figure who ruled the frontier rivers with unmatched strength. Stories describe him as a prankster, a man whose laughter was as loud as the Mississippi itself, and whose fists could silence any rival. To settlers, children, and even traveling writers, Fink became a symbol of rugged independence, proof that the American spirit was unstoppable when challenged by wild waters and wild men. His reputation spread in taverns along docks and through oral traditions that elevate him into a near-mythical hero. Legends painted Fink as larger than life. He was said to be able to lift barrels of whiskey single-handedly, drink more than any man alive, and never lose in a fight. Some stories describe him shooting tin cups off his companions' heads with flawless aim, turning dangerous stunts into drunken entertainment. Others told of his booming voice carrying across the riverbanks, daring anyone to challenge his supremacy. These tales transformed him into the ultimate frontiersman, fearless, humorous, and seemingly invincible. In the eyes of many, he embodied the wild, untamed glory of early America, a character who belonged more to folklore than flesh. The frontier environment itself helped feed the myth. Life on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers was dangerous, chaotic, and unpredictable. Boatmen were notorious for their toughness, often compared to gladiators of the waterways. Yet Fink rose above them all in story and song, celebrated as a man who could endure storms, lead men through treacherous rapids, and still in the day with laughter echoing in the night. He became a folk icon, not just for his feats, but for the idea he represented, that of the common man rising to heroic heights. In a young nation searching for identity, figures like Fink filled the cultural gap between reality and aspiration. But the more these stories spread, the more they blurred the line between truth and exaggeration. Traveling showmen, writers, and storytellers had every reason to keep polishing his image, turning his flaws into entertainment and his violence into comedy. Children learned about him as if he were a frontier cartoon character, while adults admired bravado they wished they had. Mike Fink became less a man and more of a symbol, a convenient hero for an America that preferred its legends wild but ultimately harmless. It was easier to laugh at his supposed antics than confront the darker reality behind them. And yet, even in these polished versions, shadows sometimes slipped through. The laughter in the stories often carried an edge of cruelty. The pranks were more dangerous than funny, and the fights were bloodier than anyone admitted. If he was the king of the Boatmen, then his crown was forged in something far harsher than tall tales. The question lingers: what truths were buried beneath the myth of Mike Fink? To understand Mike Fink's rise, we need to step into the world of the early 1800s, when America's frontier was pushing westward and the rivers were its lifelines. The Ohio and Mississippi were not just waterways. They were highways of commerce, carrying goods, soldiers, settlers, and stories. Boatmen were the muscle behind this expansion, moving heavy flatboats downriver through treacherous currents. They were celebrated for their strength, but also feared for their rowdy tempers. In many ways, they were the working-class warriors of the new republic. Mike Fink didn't emerge from nowhere. He was a product of this brutal, chaotic river culture. Boatmen developed reputations almost as quickly as they traveled. To some, They were indispensable pioneers who kept the economy moving. To others, they were dangerous drifters, more comfortable with a fight than a handshake. This dual image gave fertile ground for myth-making. Ordinary men could be turned into larger-than-life figures, exaggerated in songs and stories told in taverns along the riverbanks. The very chaos of the rivers demanded heroes, and out of this demand, Fink's legend flourished. His loud personality and violent bravado fit perfectly into what people wanted to hear about the frontier. Untamed men conquering untamed waters. But beneath the admiration, a darker truth circulated in whispers. Boatmen were infamous for gambling, drinking, and lawlessness. Settlement along the rivers often dreaded their arrival, knowing fights would break out and lives could be lost. In this world, a man like Fink was not simply admired, he was feared. His so-called pranks often left men bloodied, and the courage celebrated in tales was closer to recklessness that endangered others. Still, storytellers polished these brutal acts, turning them into spectacles of humor rather than horror. The contradiction was stark. America needed heroes, even if they were built on violence. There was also a cultural hunger for identity. America in the early 19th century was a young nation desperate for legends of its own, figures who could rival the knights and warriors of Europe's folklore. Mike Fink, with his rowdy laugh and deadly skill, became a convenient symbol of that desire. He represented the new kind of American hero, not noble or refined, but brash, powerful, and unafraid to spill blood. This was the frontier's answer to Europe's Arthurian legends, except here the sword was replaced by a rifle and the battlefield was a river. Yet even in this patriotic elevation, cracks appeared. Was such a hero truly admirable, or was he simply the most violent man in the room? And it's here that the seeds of doubt begin to take root. The culture needed him to be a hero, but the reality suggested something else. If the frontier celebrated strength above all else, what happens when that strength turns cruel? The line between hero and villain blurred on the muddy waters of the Ohio, and Mike Fink stood right at the center of it. The more his legend grew, the more his violence was excused, until the stories no longer sounded like history, but like cover-ups. Which raises a question. What was the real story of Mike Fink once the laughter stopped? When we strip away the polished folklore, Mike Fink emerges not as a laughing prankster, but as a dangerous man feared even by his own companions. Historical accounts describe him as quick to anger and merciless when challenged. He was known to provoke fights just for sport, often turning a night of drinking into a deadly contest. While tales remember his marksmanship with admiration, the truth is chilling. Fink frequently forced others into reckless stunts, shooting objects off their heads or daring them into fights they could not win. What sounds like entertainment in legend was, in reality, a gamble with death. One story often sanitized in retellings involves Fink shooting a tin cup from the head of a fellow boatman. In the legend, it is a display of flawless aim and daring humor. But in reality, the man reportedly trembled in terror, knowing that a drunken slip of the trigger could end his life. The event reveals the cruelty at the heart of Fink's so-called fun. These stunts were not playful. They were brutal reminders of his dominance, spectacles where companions were unwilling participants. The legend laughs, but the history shivers. Even more disturbing are reports of outright killings. Some sources suggest that Fink murdered fellow boatmen in drunken quarrels, sometimes over trivial matters. His temper, fueled by whiskey, turned lethal more than once. In a society already steeped in violence, Fink stood out as someone who embraced it, wearing his cruelty as part of his identity. While popular culture glossed over these deaths, communities along the rivers remembered him less as a hero and more as a menace. His myth was built on blood, even if storytellers chose to paint it with laughter. The most haunting truth is how easily his violence was excused or transformed into folklore. In songs and stories, the killings disappeared, replaced by exaggerated humor or harmless mischief. America didn't want a river tyrant. It wanted a symbol of frontier strength, so the deaths and brutality were buried under tall tales. Yet in quieter corners of history, whispers persisted. Mike Fink was less a hero and more a killer who thrived in a culture willing to look away. How many lives ended because of his recklessness may never be fully known, but the shadow remains. And here lies the uncomfortable question. Why did a young nation choose to celebrate a man whose hands were stained with blood? Was it because he represented something people longed for, the raw, untamed defiance of the frontier, or because myths are easier to live with than truths? The legend of Mike Fink promised laughter, but the reality left graves along the riverbanks. And as we move deeper, the symbol he became tells us as much about America as it does about him. Mike Fink's legend is not just a tale of one man. It is a mirror reflecting the values and contradictions of America's frontier. His pranks and violence, when retold as humor, symbolize a culture that admired dominance and toughness above compassion. In a young nation that needed to project strength, brutality could be disguised as entertainment, and cruelty could be reframed as courage. Fink became less a man and more a symbol of how America wanted to see itself: bold, unrestrained, and unapologetically wild. Yet what was celebrated as strength was, at its core, a silence about the suffering he caused, the trials he imposed on others, forcing men to stand with targets on their heads, daring companions into life-threatening games. Can be read as twisted versions of initiation rituals. They weren't just stunts. They were displays of power. In folklore, they were reframed as trials of loyalty or proof of skill, but psychologically, they reveal something darker. They show how violence becomes ritualized, accepted, and eventually normalized when society needs a hero. The silence of his companions was not agreement. It was fear, and that silence speaks louder than the laughter in the stories. In this way, Mike Fink becomes a symbol not of heroism, but of complicity. His presence in American folklore reflects how cultures often rewrite their most dangerous figures into something palatable. Just as fairy tales once softened ogres into playful giants, the legend of Fink softened a river tyrant into a trickster. But symbols always carry shadows, and his story forces us to ask, what does it mean when a society prefers myth over truth? Does it reveal courage, or does it expose a fear confronting its own violence? There's also the symbolism of the river itself. The Ohio and Mississippi were lifelines, but they were also unforgiving forces. Fink ruled these waters in story, but the river became a metaphor for America's identity: restless, unstoppable, and often merciless. The river carried both goods and death, just as Fink carried both laughter and bloodshed. His legend, attached so closely to the river, reminds us that nature and man alike can be glorified only when their dangers are conveniently hidden beneath the surface. And here lies the silence that lingers, the choice to laugh at violence rather than confront it, to crown a killer as a hero rather than admit the discomforting truth. Mike Fink's story, read symbolically, is not only about him but about the America that created him. The silence in his tale, the absence of the victims' voices, echoes louder than his legendary laugh. And that silence demands reflection, because it forces us to see how myths are built on what societies choose not to say. Mike Fink's story is often remembered with a grin, as if his reckless antics were harmless entertainment from a rougher time. But when the mask is pulled away, the truth is sobering. He was not a harmless trickster. He was a man who thrived on cruelty, whose reputation was sharpened through fear, not admiration. The laughter that echoed in taverns and along the riverbanks hides the cries that were never told. And that silence is as much a part of his legacy as the myth itself. What makes his story unsettling is not only what Fink did, but what America chose to do with it. A young nation, hungry for legends, reshaped a killer into a folk hero. Instead of remembering the blood he spilled, it remembered the laughter that followed. This is a sinister truth. Heroes are often chosen not because they are noble, but because they fit the story society wants to believe. And in Mike Fink's case, the story was more important than the truth. Reflecting on Fink forces us to ask harder questions. How many of our heroes today are built the same way, celebrated for their strength while their cruelty is erased? How many myths do we cling to because the truth would be too uncomfortable? Legends like Mike Fink's remind us that history is rarely clean. It is full of shadows, compromises, and silences, and the way we choose to remember says more about us than about the figures themselves. But perhaps this is why his legend still matters. By looking at the cracks in his story, we can see the danger of celebrating violence as humor and cruelty as courage. Mike Fink becomes more than just a riverboat man. He becomes a cautionary tale about the price of myths. His laugh may have once filled the rivers, But today his silence leaves us with the weight of questions we cannot ignore. The shadow he casts reminds us that every legend hides a cost. And so, the sinister truth behind Mike Fink is revealed. He was no king of the river. He was a tyrant disguised as a hero. His story challenges us to look deeper, to see through the comforting myths, and to recognize the darkness that history prefers to hide. If you want more untold truths like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. More hidden stories are on the way, and the next one may change the way you see history forever. Support the channel by becoming a member, so we can continue uncovering the secrets that others prefer to keep buried. Don't miss our next revelation. It will be even darker